Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this high-level panel event, Will the Green Deal Save Wildlife from Trafficking? I'm Jorge Rios from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. I manage the Global Program to Combat Wildlife and Forest Crime, and also a senior member to the International Consortium to Combat Wildlife Crime, otherwise known as IQWiC, a partnership between our office, UNODC, the CITES Secretariat, the World Bank, the World Customs Organization, and Interpol. The importance of continuing to address wildlife crime cannot be underestimated. And I'm very pleased that we're partnering with the Commission to host this event because this is a serious crime that not only impacts the conservation of our species, our planet, but really is linked to the broader issues also of biodiversity and climate change. So this is a real wonderful opportunity to raise this event at such a high profile opportunity. And with that, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Gara Wali, who is the Executive Director of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the UN Undersecretary General. I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Wali.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to today's high-level panel discussion. On behalf of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and our partners in the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, the CITES Secretariat, Interpol, the World Customs Organization, and the World Bank, I thank you for joining us to examine the impacts of wildlife trafficking and the role of the EU Green Deal in supporting the fight against wildlife crime. Our planet has lost over 60% of its wildlife in the past 50 years. Wildlife crime has contributed to this loss by driving species towards extinction, destroying forests and marine habitats, and disrupting ecosystems. Wildlife crime affects our planet, but also its people, by robbing communities of natural resources, increasing the risk of transmission of zoonotic diseases, fueling insecurity, and powering illicit economies. The COVID pandemic has put even more economic pressure on the most vulnerable, compounding the risks of involvement in the illegal wildlife trade. Now more than ever, we need to address wildlife crime as a serious form of organized crime by making use of the international instruments at our disposal and harmonizing legislation across regions to prevent traffickers from exploiting gaps. To help member states strengthen their prevention and criminal justice responses, UNODC has supported 40 countries with legislative assistance, building enforcement capacity and facilitating international and interagency cooperation to dismantle criminal networks and disrupt trafficking. I'm grateful to the European Commission for its steadfast support of our work. And I congratulate the European Union on its ambitious Green Deal and 2030 biodiversity strategy. I look forward to our continued collaboration in line with these frameworks. I hope that today's event will help ensure that criminal justice is fully integrated into our collective efforts to address wildlife crime threats to nature, development, and security. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Executive Director Wali for her intervention. And now I'd like to give the floor to our next speaker, the EU Commissioner for International Partnership, Ms. Jutta Urpilainen. Ms. Urpilainen, you have the floor.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Business as usual is not an option when it comes to the fighting criminal networks involved in wildlife and forest crime. The impact all over the world on ecosystems, on the existence of many species, on land and sea resources, on peace and security, and of course on people and human health is huge. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted this all too well. The recommendations prepared for these European Development Days by experts underline the importance of protecting wildlife. Its trade and consumption needs to be legal, sustainable and safe. With the European Green Deal, the EU supports and engages partners in all regions towards a just and green transition. Make no mistake, the fight against wildlife crime and timber trafficking is at the heart of these efforts. Working with EU member states through Team Europe initiatives, we will tackle the problem both at country and regional levels. We are working with partners towards better forest governance and law enforcement to put an end to harvesting and trade in illegal timber under the FLEGT action plan. We are also building holistic forest partnerships, giving everyone the chance to benefit from forests and their invaluable ecosystems services, while also protecting and restoring them to address climate and biodiversity threats. Finally, the EU is now the main contributor to the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. Dear friends, the fight against wildlife and timber trafficking links with our priorities on biodiversity, climate, support to vulnerable groups, and fight against insecurity. I hope today's exchange will help us steer the ongoing review of the EU's action plan on wildlife trafficking. And I look forward to hearing the outcome of your discussions.
I'd like to thank Commissioner Upperleinen for her comments. And now I have the pleasure to introduce today's panel. The panel will be moderated by Her Royal Highness, Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands, who will be joined by 4 distinguished speakers. And it's my pleasure to introduce them as well. Mr. Koen Doens, who is the Director General for the Directorate General International Partnerships, my good friend, Dr. Emmanuel de Moreau, Director of the Virunga National Park in the DRC, Dr. Christian Samper, the Chief Executive and President of the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, and Ms. Nomsa Kamanga, a young leader from Zambia. Your Royal Highness, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jorge. Great to see you. And before I introduce in just a few minutes what we're going to talk about, I'd love to I'm Laurentien, so do call me Laurentien. And if I may return that joy of calling you by your first names, let's have an open dialogue. Emmanuel, wonderful to see you. Nomsa and Mr. Doens, if I can call you Koen, and Mr. Samper, Christian, wonderful to have you here with us. And let's have a real dialogue on a topic that is more important than ever before. Indeed, as also the Commissioner highlighted, and the Director of UNODC. I'd love to explore 3 clusters of topics with you as a dialogue. One is to explore how wildlife, biodiversity, health, security, climate, and development are all intertwined. And I'd love to hear, especially because you, Emmanuel, and Nomsa, you're here, how that works and the role of communities in this, also linked to the earlier point made about vulnerable people. The second is to explore how the Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, but also the action plan on wildlife trafficking from 2016, which I understand is now under review. It's really interesting to bring that into the conversation, how they can all work together to curb and to prevent wildlife trafficking. And the key elements, of course, being enforcement, cooperation, and also prevention. And the last topic I'd like to explore, like a necklace with beads on it as a dialogue, is how to frame wildlife trafficking so that, one, it's recognized as a serious crime, that it's seen as a precondition to achieve the goals of the Green Deal and not just the other way around, to make sure it's high up on the political agenda, and that all key players understand their different roles, including perhaps we can explore, particularly with you, Koen, as you're with the partnerships, how the private sector and the judicial system, how we have to bring them into the conversation, and how, for example, banks need to understand their role in the crime networks. And in this, to close, to set the scene of this dialogue, how the international, regional and local cooperation, how that's intertwined. So I hope you feel that you're in the right dialogue, that we're touching on all the right issues. Let's start, and I'd love to pick up on what the Commissioner was saying. Business as usual is no longer an option in the context of COVID-19. So I'd like to kick off with the question, why is it that this particular time, as we're grappling with the COVID-19 crisis, it's more important than ever before? And if I can just kick off with you, Nomza, why do you feel that COVID is giving us a new urgent setting to discuss these topics that have been on the agenda for many, many years? Nomza.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I feel COVID-19 has given us this urgent need to start talking about these problems that we are currently facing right now, because it has affected everyone. Everyone all around the world has felt the impact of it, even those that never really knew about what wildlife is all about, what those who didn't really know what it is to protect and to guard these natural resources was all about. Now everyone has an idea of what it is and why we should protect it, and why trafficking is an urgent need that we need, an urgent problem that we need to start discussing and to talk about right now. So it is very urgent, and I feel this is the right place to be in and discuss these issues, because if we let it slip, then we will not see a greener globe. Thank you.
I also hear you say that actually it's raised the awareness and it heightened the awareness, which is very much what we need to put this on the agenda. I know, Koen, that this is also a topic that's very close to your heart, of never waste a good crisis. Can you comment on this?
Laurentine, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that these crises, like COVID-19, I mean, they act in two ways. They are, on the one hand, they're an accelerator, but they're also a magnifying glass. And I think that what COVID-19 has done is precisely to put the magnifying glass on this connection between global health and the protection of forests and biodiversity. I mean, most of the pandemics that we have faced lately over the last decade are of zoonotic nature. Yeah. I know that the origins of COVID-19 are still debated, but we can enlarge it, and it shows us how much the way in which we engage, in which we deal with our biodiversity, with natural resources, has an impact, a fundamental potential impact on health. And if you look at Ebola, if you look at some of the other pandemics, it is very obvious. And COVID-19 has made us realize all across the globe the importance of that. Once you start looking at that, you immediately dig into the different other dimensions, because it is, of course, a multidimensional challenge, wildlife. It takes you to the environment. It makes you look at why are certain people doing certain things that ultimately end up hurting ourselves. There's the supply side of it, there's the demand side of it. And this is where, I mean, some of the very concrete work we are doing with Emmanuel, obviously, but also in other places across Africa, and by the way, also in Asia, is such interesting. Once you get into the granularity of things, once you start talking and working with local communities, and you take that kind of 360-degree view on why are some of these things happening and how can we interact with the law enforcement side, with the prosperity side, the economic side of things, with the protection of the planet and so on, then it gets granular, it gets difficult, but it gets very rewarding.
Well, if I can pick up on that, and knowing you, Emmanuel, for many years, definitely that's you. When it gets granular, when it gets difficult, you live that with the danger of your own and the vulnerability and the strength of your own life. Can you, from your perspective, from Virunga, can you delve into that? What Koen is bringing on and putting into words of how the intertwined of health and ecosystems and security and climate change and trafficking all comes together at a local level?
Yeah, thank you, Laurentine. And thanks so much for bringing me in on this panel, which is obviously fascinating for me. I think it's good to start on the issue of disease. We're quite reluctant actors on that incredibly important issue. And of course, there are two aspects to these horrific diseases that have, affected all of us so badly in recent months. One is the aspect of the zoonotic origins of COVID in particular, but also Ebola and others. And the other, of course, is how these diseases are contained. How do we respond to them? And that issue in particular is something we've had to confront in Virunga. We've had 4 major diseases in the last 3 years. Chronic outbreaks of cholera. 40% of all cholera outbreaks in the DRC were in the Virunga area. Then, of course, the second worst Ebola epidemic in history, which was around Virunga National Park. And then, of course, COVID, which has affected us so badly in so many ways, economically as well as affecting our staff. And then finally, just a few weeks ago, an outbreak of anthrax, which had its origins with the hippo populations in Virunga National Park. The park authorities have found themselves at the center of every single one of those disease outbreaks. Just to give a couple of examples, COVID and cholera, it's the electricity produced by Virunga National Park through investments from the European Union and others that power the pumping stations that provide water, which in communities living in extreme poverty is the main ingredient for combating disease. It's the main condition. Ebola, Ebola was framed, Ebola was a disease that affected us for over 2 years. The UN coordinator on Ebola response brought Virunga into the committee, the Ebola Response Committee, on the basis of what he recognized as the national park being the natural firewall for containing the disease. And that's really what we worked on. And so there are many other ways of looking at this problem, but there's no way of disassociating the natural environment from the resilience that human communities have in managing disease.
And Emmanuel, if I can just follow up on a question of you're in the deep heart of the DRC, you're fighting with your life every day. Does it feel that how do you bring climate change and all the aspects that are covered under the Green Deal? How do you live that every day? Or do you feel, and the people you work with, do they feel that's another debate? Or do you actually see that this is a debate that is coming together in Virunga on the ground as well?
It's a complex question. I don't know how good I am at answering it, except to say that everything is connected. And so, you've brought us together on the subject of wildlife trafficking, which really touches on issues of rule of law and governance over natural resources. The UN group of experts have just released their latest report today, but have been producing reports every 6 months for 20 years now, since 2001. Every single one of those reports, in analyzing the underlying causes of conflict in the DRC, conflict that has provoked the death of 8 million people, every single one of those reports pinpoints the illegal trafficking of natural resources as one of the driving forces behind armed conflict. So yes, it touches absolutely everything. And the the wildlife and, more importantly, its habitats represent a trafficking economy, a war economy of about $170 million a year in Virunga. That's enough money to finance an army. It's enough to finance a war. And so it really is at the heart of all of our problems.
Yeah. Christian, I can imagine that you rightly put under in words as well, saying you see things deteriorating, you're fighting behind it to make sure that it is high up on the political agenda. We'll talk about that in a moment. But are you, this intertwining, do you also feel that this magnifying glass that Koen is indicating, you feel hopeful that now finally people are getting this connection between disease and wildlife trafficking and climate change? Do you see that around you, that people are now more aware and that this magnifying glass is actually helping this debate?
Yes, I do very much, because the world is facing those three main crises: the loss of biodiversity, climate change, and these pandemics. And wildlife trafficking is exactly at the center of those three. And the solutions for all of these are intertwined, as we mentioned before. But I'm more hopeful. I think this has been a wake-up call. The pandemic has really forced us to think about it. And I agree. I mean, one thing we know is that about 70% of all the emerging infectious diseases that we as humans have experienced in the last few decades are of zoonotic origin. And interesting, within that, you see directly things like the consumption of wild mammals and birds and others are key in terms of the spread of some of these things, as is the deforestation, increasing the human-wildlife contact. So I think people are really waking up to this. I think this is a moment when the whole world, this pandemic has impacted everyone across the world. It's a moment where we realize that the solutions need to be focused on here. I just hope that we go beyond sort of looking at how we respond to these things to how we prevent them. And we know the prevention is directly tied with better management of ecosystems, reducing the human-wildlife interface, and yes, very much combating wildlife trade.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up Nomza, if I can continue on that. That you have very much the role of women in communities and the strength of women, but also the role in communities. All of these issues are actually coming together. Do you find that people are more aware now at a local level of the fact that these issues are intertwined, or is that still something maybe slightly at a distance, or do people actually are living that as well from your perspective?
I think people are actually learning about it now. It's not like everybody has known about it. And that's why we are here right now. And that is why we need to pick it up from here, because it's not everybody. Of course, people have been affected and they have known about what COVID-19 is all about. But it's not everyone who is really open-minded, and it's not everyone in the communities who has known where it has come from and why it has come about. So this is where now we step in and continue, sensitizing people and telling them the issues that have brought us into this today and why there is COVID-19 right now. But also community members, we see they have an open mind and they are willing to learn. When you engage them and when you go to talk to them about these issues, they are more open-minded right now because they have seen the kind of impact that these wildlife trafficking issues have brought. And it is only because there is COVID-19, which is agreeing with what Christian has just said. It is a wake-up call, and everyone now is becoming alert, and they want to tackle it. So, yes. Yeah, I think there is a lot of connection with it.
Let's move on from the local communities and actually showing the link that local, regional, international is all very much linked, and we need to link up those various lines in order to actually start not just fighting it, but as you rightly say, we have to start preventing it and getting ahead of the game. But so can you? So I'd like to invite the public and those listening to this extremely insightful comments. If you have questions. Somebody will be feeding them to me, so I'll be a bit like a DJ, trying to get the questions and coming back to them. But I'd like to continue with you on how the Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, as well as the action plan on wildlife trafficking of the EU, under revision, hopefully being, I'm sure that Koen, you can maybe comment a bit on that. How should all of them work together in order to achieve the goals that we need to achieve, both on wildlife trafficking and on the Green Deal? And then to make it more complicated, obviously, there's a link to CITES and there's a link to the SDGs. So who would like to untangle and put together again the intertwinedness of these various policy ambitions? Koen, perhaps if I can start with you.
Thanks a lot for being volunteered. Well, maybe two or 3 points. I mean, first of all, we of course, from a European point of view, like to talk a lot about our Green Deal and our European EU biodiversity strategy and so on. And I think, and rightly so, because we are trying to walk the talk. We are trying to turn some of the ambitions that we have set in the Paris Agreement, hopefully when it comes to biodiversity at the Kunming summit, also translated into important international commitments. We're trying to show in Europe how we are embracing these commitments and turning them into reality. But obviously our ambitions are indeed global, and therefore a lot of things need to happen outside. First of all, because there is, of course, a direct spillover effect of the things we do in Europe. After all, we are a big trading partner for partners across the globe, so access to the EU market can be leveraged or determined by some of these legislations that we adopt. So there is this direct link. But secondly, there is also an indirect link in terms that it allows us, it positions us well to engage with partners across the globe and say, now, how can we work with you to also translate those global ambitions into things that you want to do? And that's where the pieces are intertwined. Now, I would just like to come back here on a point that was made in the previous interventions. I think that fear is of course a big driver of human beings, and I think indeed the COVID-19 has allowed us to make that kind of interlinkage with climate, wildlife trafficking, biodiversity and so on. But we also know that we respond better to hope than to fear. And so I think fear for me is only a starting point. And we now need to build and present what we want to do, not as kind of a reaction out of fear, but actually show the very positive agenda. And sorry, Emmanuel, to refer again to you, but we know that it's more than a decade of investment in the Virunga. It's a work of a long haul. But I think that what Emmanuel has been able to do is to turn this into a very positive dynamic, whereby people actually see that what is being done now is to the benefit of everything and everyone. And it has become a very positive project to show. And that's, I think, a real ambition we should have, is to see how the local, the national, the regional, because even the national, I mean, the Virunga is now generating revenue, no longer from plundering, but generating revenue for the state. And so you can build a positive case. And that's, I think, what we would need to do locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. And that's, for me, a real top priority. That's where all these things come together, but need to be formulated in a positive agenda.
I come back to the framing in a moment. I'd just like to, one additional question that I think that I found that in the debates people are perhaps not so aware of, is this indeed the specific role of the EU in this intertwined debate, local level, regional level, national and international level, but that the EU itself is also a transit market, a destination and a source market. Christian, do you find that in this debate with all the partners that you work with, do you find that people are aware of that? And how do you see, from your perspective, as an NGO, the role of the EU in this intertwined of the Green Deal and all of these policy ambitions that I just mentioned?
Look, wildlife crime is a global problem, and we have all these international connections. So, for example, we've done a lot of work around elephant poaching in Africa and the markets in Asia. But as you said, a lot of those routes actually go through the European Union. So even getting the European Union to take measures, even though it may not be the best market, but to limit the transit of some of these issues is important. Another key example is pet trade. For a lot of birds and reptiles and amphibians and others, we're seeing a flow from Latin America into North America and Europe and some of these other places. So clearly, the measures that can be taken in the EU itself are critical for this. And the investments that the EU is making in some of these countries to disrupt that whole chain is really important. So, for example, we're working on a project right now on sustainable wildlife management in Africa with the European Union, which is critical to really tackle these issues at the source in some of these African countries. And some of these are critical for local communities, as we've seen in Virunga and many places where we work, but also looking at the consumers in places like Europe. So that international cooperation is absolutely critical to be able to tackle this problem.
And do you feel, what would be your message to those working on the Green Deal specifically, who perhaps might not be so deeply into wildlife trafficking? What's your plea to them to say, realize that by investing in combating and preventing wildlife trafficking, it helps you achieve your goals on the Green Deal? What would be your plea?
I'd start with the connection between things like biodiversity and climate, the fact that natural-based solutions contribute about 30% of the global climate solution. So if you're really interested as well, look at biodiversity. Don't forget that the two main drivers that we're looking at here are habitat destruction and over-exploitation and wildlife trafficking. So if you really want to protect some of the wildlife and some of these issues that are critical for local livelihoods and, by the way, for global climate change regulation, you have to preserve biodiversity. And the only way to do that is by including wildlife trade as one of the key issues.
Yeah. Koen, would you, what are you telling your colleagues around this to make sure that they understand the connection between them?
Not much to say, they all do, because really, I mean, that's the way in which we approach it, that's the way in which we design our programs, and this is really very well understood by all of us.
But your colleagues who might not be so deeply into perhaps we should look at the prevention. One is to combat wildlife crime, but another one is the prevention. Emmanuel, what do you feel are should be the key areas of focus in order to really start looking at prevention?
Well, I think, an integrated approach to all of these enormous challenges that really dominate our generation is important. Medical practitioners alone are not going to solve the problem of pandemics. It takes a much broader team. The one thing about wildlife practitioners is that ever since Rio, we've been forced to take a much broader agenda. We can no longer afford to just be looking at the gorillas and the elephants, but the much wider issues of society around these protected areas. So that's one aspect. And of course, those natural ecosystems are critical to these solutions, be it climate, be it disease, and so on. And I think that's been really well addressed by this panel. But the other aspect, which is really important to us, particularly in Virunga, because we're a very human national park. We have we share this space with 5 million people, and 5 million people who suffered 30 years of civil war, and who live in extreme poverty. And of course, that's the issue of social justice. When we're talking about wildlife, in many cases, we're talking about international public goods. There's a benefit from those goods, which goes to the whole of humanity, but there's also a cost, and that tends to be borne by the people who live around those protected areas, who are often among the poorest people on earth. And that cost in Virunga can be estimated at over $1 billion of lost access to agricultural land. It's huge. And I think, you know, that we were talking about the role of the European Union, that the European Union 30 years ago decided to step up and, you know, fulfill a role which is to share that burden. Today, it's 12,000 employments that have been created from the national park. It's heading towards a GDP impact of $1 billion a year in a few years' time. And so we're realizing that effort to try and address issues of social injustice, which is it's the poorest people on earth who generally bear the cost of environmental damage, which is, you know, carried out by the rest of humanity.
Yeah, and it requires a long-term vision, as you rightly also put out. In the meantime, I've received a question from the public. This is very much of a hybrid gathering, and it's a question, I guess, to you, Koen, but anyone else can add to that as well. How you see how the EU sees the role of the UN and the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime in fighting wildlife trafficking. How would you? What would be your answer to that, Koen?
Well, it can't be done without them. That's very clear. I mean, as you've said, there are the multiple layers that need to be addressed: local, national, regional, and international, global. Without global action, things simply won't add up. And that's where, for us, the UN comes in. By the way, as my commissioner has said, we are a substantial financial contributor to this as well, because we do think that it is an essential piece of the whole puzzle. If you don't do that, all the rest somehow doesn't add up.
Yes. Perhaps Nomza, do you have anything to add to that from the local perspective and to really have also the community perspective, so that we keep bearing in mind that all the layers are part of that in the end the SDGs kind of live up here, but they all come from on the ground, and all of the issues covered by the SDGs are actually the ones living in those communities.
Yes. Definitely. So speaking from a local perspective, I believe all these discussions that I hear right now are something that will help in finding solutions that local communities are facing. We need to realize that these are the people that are living with wildlife, and they are the ones that are facing the direct challenges of human-wildlife conflict, challenges of zoonotic diseases, and everything else that comes in. We can only implement on the ground right now, but the response should come from everywhere else, and that is a global response that we would need to have. So these challenges are global, but there are people that have given themselves to act on the ground, and that is the people in the communities, the ones that are living with these wildlife, the ones that are protecting it, and they are the ones that need to be helped first, because they first face the challenges that are coming from protecting these wildlife species. So yeah, the implementation can be done on the ground, but the response should come globally.
If I can continue on that point and connecting it to the point that Koen was making about the importance of framing it with hope and not on the basis of fear, how would you feel the framing would be the right one in order for wildlife trafficking to be put up high on the political agenda, to be seen as a precondition to achieving the Green Deal ambitions, but also for the key players to understand their roles? This has been my frustration, that sometimes, for example, key players in the private sector might not understand that they have a crucial role to play in the chain of command in combating the full chain in wildlife crime. What would be your thoughts on how should we frame this?
Especially communities should first be engaged. There is dialogue that needs to be there for everyone to understand, but also not neglecting the fact that these people who are living with these wildlife species, there is investment that needs to be done for them to understand fully, because when you are getting a tangible benefit from protecting wildlife, I believe these people who have the zealous hearts of protecting their biodiversity, but also protecting wildlife species. And even if any outsider would come to them to offer them or to bribe them anything, for them maybe to kill an elephant, they would definitely say no to it because they know that they're getting something from it. So it's just about sensitization, it's about engagement, it's about dialogue and acting together.
Young people, you work a lot with young people. Do you feel that young people understand the link between preserving wild and conserving wildlife and also their own livelihoods? Do they understand? Are they driven by that, or is that something that you really need to engage them on actively, or is that something that you feel is kind of there?
I can't really say we are there right now, but we are heading there. We engage a lot of young people, and especially females, right now, and just try to build them to become future leaders, because from my local community, a lot of children have been helped, and that is the benefit they are getting from living with these wildlife species. We have conservation practitioners, and we have a lot of donors that are coming in to help with the education and everything else that follows. But we have a lot that we need to do, especially by making these young people understand the importance of living with wildlife species, and also the importance of preserving wildlife itself. So we are heading there.
Christian, what is for you? What are for you key drivers to frame this issue, perhaps to help develop the messaging, particularly taking in consideration that we're living in a new time, that there's new awareness, the magnifying glass that Koen was talking about. Where do you feel the framing should be so that the issue is recognized as a serious crime and high up on the political agenda, and because it's not fully understood across the board? Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this kind of discussion.
Yeah, so let me add a word here on education, which is so important here in terms of not just creating awareness about people about the challenge of the problems, but inspiring them to do something about it. We're headquartered here in New York City, and one of the things that we realize is in an increasingly urbanized world, more and more people are becoming disconnected from nature. So I think looking at how we inspire those people, how we show them the connection that they have with this nature, and how their actions are directly or indirectly important for this is important. It starts with the people. I'm actually very hopeful that the younger generation is so much more aware about the importance and connections around environmental issues. I think a lot of the local indigenous communities and local groups know this very well. They just often don't have those choices. But I think it's empowering people to have a voice and to make the right choices, including by voting and by electing the right kind of people and pushing that change. I think we're starting to see that. We're starting to see the consumers pushing companies, pushing governments to make some of these changes. And what we need to do is make sure that that connection around wildlife and wildlife trafficking is included as part of this, and really making a strong case that we share this planet with 10 million species. We have a responsibility around this. It's not only about them, but it's also about us. And that this pandemic has shown us that that relationship is broken. We need to reset it. So I think I'm actually very hopeful. It's an issue of whether our generation can take the steps to hand over the right tools on the planet for the future.
Right. Koen, on this framing, and indeed to can build on this kind of hope, there's also a question on that from the public that says that the problem sometimes seems to be so remote. Why should each of us care about wildlife, and how do we motivate each other? So to build on what Christian was saying, and somebody in the public is actually saying, okay, well, give me the arguments so that I can actually play that role that Christian is describing. What would be your answer?
Well, I think when it comes to framing, of course, a lot depends on the audience you're talking to. I think if you look at the demand side of it, indeed, this is very often, I mean, middle classes or richer people who want these kind of things as kind of exotic prices. It's illegal, and there the whole approach should indeed be to discourage it very strongly with law enforcement operations. It's about how we can leverage the market. It's about due diligence measures and so on. So there we should take a very hard one, basically the kind of naming and shaming approach, and go beyond. That's one way of framing it when it comes to the demand side. But then there is the supply side. And there I think it's really essential, and that's why I was building in the hope element, is that if we present things, or if it is perceived by the local communities as somehow us wanting to save the planet at the expense of the people, it is not going to work. It's really not going to work. And you need to turn it the other way around, which is we need to build an offer that can actually show local communities that there is a way forward that at the same time allows them to protect the planet, biodiversity, wildlife, while at the same time improving their own livelihoods, the ecosystems in which they work, and thirdly, by looking at the third P, the prosperity angle, that this will then generate through sustainable agriculture, through ecotourism and so on, revenue that ultimately will make their lives better. And for us, that's a real essential thing. Whether we look, and so the whole Natura Africa initiative that we will start deploying on the African continent, looking at these areas, will be very much inspired by that. Whether we are looking at fighting deforestation in Ghana, Ivory Coast, very much driven by cacao, or whether we are looking at some of the other aspects, our starting point will always be how can we improve the lives of people who now tend to do trafficking or deforestation, not for the pleasure of it, but because it's a key source of income, which otherwise they don't have. And so we need to build a very positive case there. If not, we will never be able to handle the demand side, the supply side.
Yes, so Emmanuel, this is of course your work has been on this in this area as much as protecting the gorillas and the forests, but it's also been very much to work with local communities. Can you build on that from your perspective on what Koen is saying?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's you know, certainly over the last, I'd say, 2 decades, our whole outlook, our strategy has evolved. In fact, it's more than evolved. It's transformed from a very traditional approach to enforcing the law, which is, you know, the first part of Koen's analysis, as it were. And of course, you know, that doesn't go away. Societies are regulated and maintained and supported by the law, and it's profoundly important. But if societies don't understand the fairness and the justice aspects of those laws, they won't obey them. And that's really where that transformation has happened, is that unless we're able to support those laws with an element of fair play, where we're not asking, in our case, the people of Congo to bear the full cost of, be it biodiversity conservation, be it preserving the forest for climate reasons, we're faced with a dilemma which we can't overcome. In our case, it's the European Union that really set the example, that accompanied us through that transformation of understanding that we need to reach a critical mass of support for those communities, for these extraordinary sites and these globally important ecosystems to be preserved. There's no shortcut to that. It needs to be fair.
So in the 10 minutes that we have left in this conversation, I'd like to step up the gear and make it even sharper about ensuring that The Green Deal is giving us, if you talk about a story of hope, of ambition, that will need to take not just governments, but governments need to take inhabitants of every country and the international community with us in order to start achieving those goals. What are the levers that need to be really now in this window of opportunity, linking it to the broader challenges on climate change? What are the levers of change that really we should say it's not in 5 years, but it's really now that need to happen in order for politicians, in order for policymakers, in order for law enforcement officers, in order for the judicial system to understand, listen, this is, as the commissioner said, no longer business as usual. It's now that we need to act. What are the key levers for change that we need to start pulling now? Christian.
So I had the opportunity to be part of the high-level panel on biodiversity, and the results are going to be presented. The recommendations to the EU are being presented at the end of the sessions today. But let me just mention that one of those specifically deals with the issue of wildlife trade and these issues. And really, it's about promoting the legal, sustainable, and safe wildlife use. And there we're talking about some of the issues we've discussed here around supply and demand and linking those and making sure that that's clearly in place. That includes legal frameworks, it includes education, it includes technology. The second issue about really empowering and benefiting local communities, very much what we've been discussing, and having those investments be done. And the third one is really drawing that connection very explicitly between what's happening, the connection between things like wildlife crime and pandemics, and also the connection between conserving biodiversity and climate. I think the EU has a critical role to play in both at the global level in really pushing, for example, high ambition at the Kunming meeting on biodiversity. We actually feel that it should be really important to have a fourth protocol under UNCTAD specifically dealing with wildlife crime. So the EU as a bloc is a really important player there. But then we need to implement this. And to implement it, we need the investment in building stronger institutions, training and financing the work that we're doing in places like Virunga and around the world to really empower this. So I think it's an incredibly important role, and I'm incredibly hopeful that this may represent a year when we raise our ambition, we share the lessons we've learned, and we invest in making that transformation happen.
So I believe that if we share our frustrations with each other more openly, and we say my personal frustration is X, and you connect them to other frustrations from the framing of hope and going forward, it's easier, we become sharper. What is your personal frustration? You're deep in this work, you have so much knowledge, but where you say, okay, let me share this with you. My deepest frustration is X, so that maybe somebody else says, oh, I didn't realize. Well, then let's start working on it to make it concrete. What is a frustration where you say, we've got to start fixing this?
Well, probably my biggest frustration is that the whole world seems to have really woken up to the issues around climate. And we now have a real focus on becoming climate neutral by 2050. And I admire that, private sector companies and everyone's, but biodiversity has not received the same level of attention. So we need to change that discourse. And what we need to do is strive for a planet, a vision that's both carbon neutral and nature positive. That nature positive piece has been left out, and I really want to see that there and have that translated to the specific investments that we need to do, including on preventing pandemics, including in nature-based solutions to climate, and including an investment in local solutions and protection in the places where we work.
Yes. Koen, what is your frustration? I know that you're a man of hope, you're optimistic, you work so hard at it. But where do you say, okay, come on, we've got to start fixing this?
Exactly the same, if I may. It's exactly the same. I mean, we need a Kunming summit that sets out for biodiversity an agenda that is as ambitious as the Paris Agreement was for climate, because we've seen how we could subsequently leverage the Paris Agreement. It's not easy, but it becomes a tool to leverage ambitious action. And we need that for Kunming. And to be honest, I don't see, I'm not sure we are on track on delivering a real ambitious outcome in Kunming. And for me, that's therefore a real essential element. The second frustration is, I mean, it's a natural one. It's hard to do. It's hard to do. I mean, we are in an interesting time now, because we have we've come at the end of our 7-year budgetary cycle. We are starting a new budgetary cycle at the EU level. We have a new instrument to fund our cooperation with the rest of the world. I mean, around 80 billion euros. In Africa alone, more than 29 billion euros. So we are now looking at how will we use that money. That's a comfortable situation. That's why I'm a man of hope, no doubt, because there is money to spend. But at the same time, we also know that it's not money that is the solution. It's people who are the solution. And to design, to make the right choices, to put the right policy reforms in track, to make the right things happen, funding can help. Funding is like oil in the engine, but more is needed. And that requires hard work, granular work, and that's for me the second frustration, which is it's at the macro level very important and good to set ambitions, but subsequently the problems really start when you start translating them at the micro level. So there's a lot of important work ahead of us.
And maybe to link that to a question I've just been given, but it's actually build on this, is at the macro level, yes, okay, but it's the granularity. I love that when you really start delving into it. And this is the level where you start finding competing issues. So a question from the audience is, how do you make sure you keep it on the political level when there's so many other competing issues, where in a pillarized and siloed world of policymaking, people say, well, but listen, but now there's another priority. How do you deal with that? That must also be a frustration sometimes.
Well, less and less, because it's true, as human beings, we tend to like to think in pillars or binary. I mean, we used to come a few years ago, it was still a competition between sustainability and productivity. It's clear now that that is gone. Sustainability and productivity perfectly go hand in hand. And I think that one of the things that also came very clearly out of this debate is precisely that, you cannot tackle just one piece. It's all intertwined. Security, governance, climate, biodiversity, economic prosperity, ecosystems, sustainable agriculture. And it's only in as much as we manage to design these very complex programs together with our partners that we are able to really deliver something. So for me, the issue of competition between priorities is one that plays out, no doubt, at global level. But once you start zooming in on the ground, you can see how all these things fit. And either you work on all of them, or if you only work on one of them, it's useless, because one will undo the other.
Yeah, no, that's indeed, it's all about systemic change. And I'm hearing you say we need to have actually the programs, the processes, but also the understanding and the mandates of the people who are actually in those pillarized policy areas to understand that you need to cooperate, because otherwise you won't deliver on any of the ambitions, which is a very important message, I guess, also to this broad audience. We need to start wrapping up, but I'd like to close perhaps with Nonza and Emmanuel. Emmanuel, your frustration, where you say you've been in this hard work for so many years, and we all admire you for that. Building also on this nature positive message that Christian is rightly underlining. What is your plea from in Virunga?
Laurentine, you mustn't get me on the subject of frustration, because I'll talk for hours. But
I know. We'll do it another time.
Yes, but no, I think it's more our inability to really frame our problems and identify the solutions in an effective, straightforward way. We live on the planet that created us. We understand it. We know what the problems are. And actually the solutions are not that complex. When we complexify it, it's generally because we're trying to hide another agenda. And that does, it's not honest, and that does create enormous frustration. Preserving, natural ecosystems is it's very straightforward. It's the abundance and the number of species and the integrity of their habitats. We understand that perfectly. There's nothing more than that. And yet we need armies of experts to complexify it in order to find solutions which we still haven't found. So I think really it's tied to that. It's just simplifying the solutions to these enormous problems that we're confronted with.
Okay, we need to close, otherwise the organizers will hit me over the head from far away. But I do want one word from Nomza. Are women, are young women, young people, are they feeding your hope?
Yes, most definitely. They are feeding my hope because there is a lot of potential and there are a lot of ideas. It's only a few things that have been lacking, and that is empowerment and also, funding all the ideas that young children or young people may come up with so that they can be implemented. There are a lot of initiatives on the ground that need to go out there and make a difference. But what we need is to be engaged and to be helped and supported at the end of the day. So there is a lot of potential, and that's why I say there is hope.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We need to close, but I'd like to thank all four of you for your incredibly insightful comments. There is no way I can do any summary. I won't. But for me, the key words, ambition, granularity, hard work, and ultimately systemic change is really what is needed, and stepping up international, regional, national and local cooperation. So I'd like to thank you very much and wish you all the best in all of your work. And thank you, and I'm sure that the audience found this most inspiring. Thank you so much.